Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hey there! Thanks for joining me today for this next episode of Falling Through the Trap. I'm just going to hop right in. Today's episode is about Folsom execution number 9, Charles H. Raymond, executed April 8th, 1898, and number 12, Harry Winters, executed December 8th, 1899. After a string of robberies and burglaries, Charles H. Raymond was sentenced in 1888 to 15 years at Folsom. At the time, he was 39 and used the name Samuel E. Moore. No relation. Harry Winters, a Swede or German, it seemed to go back and forth, found himself at Folsom in 1890 under a 6-year sentence for burglary. He was 37. Yet another burglar, James Willett, in his early to mid-20s, landed at Folsom in 1891 under a 6-year sentence. Each of these men were all arrested in San Francisco. Winters was released in August of 1896, and Raymond and Willett were both released a year later, only 4 days apart, in September of 1897. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all of that. The three of them at Folsom in the mid-1890s. Raymond was said to be devoutly religious. Apparently, his constant praying earned him the nickname Deacon, and the idea he was pretty darn repentant, which was why he was released early, serving 9 of his 15-year sentence. These men lived during a time of rapid growth in California, especially in San Francisco, including South San Francisco, the San Bruno area. The town of Bawden was established around 1891. It hadn't existed when the 3 men went into Folsom. So even during a short prison sentence, a lot of change happened on the outside of the prison walls. So imagine coming into a world that looked very different than the one you just left. Ask anyone who spent time in prison. These 3 men, under the charge of the notoriously cruel warden Charles All and his equally cruel guards and their captain, Richard J. Murphy, whose idea of rehabilitation was to, quote, beat the spirit out of a criminal, probably weren't inspired to give back to the world and left the prison maybe with $5 and maybe a train ticket, but definitely with hardened resentment. Labor jobs, farm work, construction, industrial, those were the opportunities available at the time, especially for those recently out of prison. And that's what Harry Winters did for about a year, farm work. He had been a gardener before his incarceration, and, well, a burglar on the side. Raymond seemed to take a more balancing approach to life. He apparently collected for the Salvation Army while doing the occasional burglary job. Willett is said to have worked in a meatpacking plant after his prison stint, but for all 3, they were always on the lookout for the next score. Now, South San Francisco had exploded by 1897. The eastern part of South San Francisco was home to the area's stockyards, the meatpacking industry, and was billed as a mini Chicago. In fact, Swift and Company from the Windy City built a $2.5 million 7-story facility in Baden, bringing with them their modern machinery and refrigeration, considered at the time by Californians as some new age woo-woo. But that was also because this new facility, incorporated as the Western Meat Company, undercut the price of meat in San Francisco. And this caused what was called the Meat Wars. So local butchers told consumers that refrigerated meat was dangerous and that they shouldn't eat it. Thankfully, refrigeration did catch on. Other industries moved in as well: paint, steel, lumber, pottery, and soon the area was dubbed the Industrial City. Now, instead of stockyards, you'll find hotels and airplanes. San Francisco International Airport is now there. More inland is the town of Baden, and once established around 1891, it grew fast. And this was exciting because it extended San Francisco's electric transit line into San Mateo, and Baden had built a powerhouse enabling the first interurban streetcar, able to go from one city to another, and by the end of 1902, it had extended 13 miles south to San Mateo and lasted until 1949. Back in 1892, Irishman Patrick Farrader built the Grand Hotel, the third hotel built in South San Francisco. It was originally located at 725 San Bruno Road, as it was called then. Now it's Airport Boulevard. 133 years later, the building still exists, although the street number has also changed, 731 Airport Boulevard. Patrick's brother, John Farrader, had operated a hotel in San Francisco, so that work seemed to run in the family. By 1897, 41-year-old Pat Farrader had been through a lot. In January of 1893, he lost his 7-year-old son. Then in July that same year, his wife Mary died the day after giving birth to a baby girl. He was now making good money. Most of the 20 to 30 regular boarders worked at the Western Meat Company, and a good portion of the men's paychecks went to him. His brother-in-law, Richard Connolly, boarded at the hotel as well. He worked for the city's road department, and he too lost his son, a 10-month-old, a year earlier. And I believe his wife, Patrick's sister Mary, lived there as well. On November 25th, Thanksgiving Day of 1897, James Willett, who had been out of prison for about 2.5 months, strolled into Ripon, California, at the time a small farming community just north of Modesto. He needed a job and to put some distance between him and Baden, where on November 17th, 8 days prior, he was involved in a robbery gone wrong that ended in the death of a man. Willett had a very engaging personality, gregarious, and he loved to talk about his adventures, or escapades as they were. Using the name John Henderson, Willett met Edward Gabriel, who had been working on a potato farm in Salida, just south of Ripon, and he hired this now fugitive to work on the farm. After about 6 or 7 days, the two men got to talking, and because Gabriel appeared as a captive audience, Willett's kryptonite, he couldn't help himself and told his story. It appears Willett had had a score to settle with Patrick Farrader, the owner of the Grand Hotel. Willett accused the man of cheating him out of money when Willett boarded at the hotel during his short stint of working in the meatpacking plant after his prison release. Because the hotel housed employees of the Western Meat Company, it was said that every Tuesday, a large portion of their paychecks went to Ferreter. This meant that about $300, over $10,000 today, in lodging fees would be ripe for the taking in the wee hours on Wednesday mornings. But Willett wanted help, and he enlisted his friend, Charles H. Raymond, who suggested bringing on another man. Willett didn't name him. He told Gabriel that the, quote, third party was a tenderfoot and a bum, and that he didn't want him in on the deal. So the man's role was limited. He provided a couple of guns. What Willett brought to the table was that he knew the interior layout of the two-story hotel and that Ferreter's room sat at the end of a long, dark hallway. But to get there, Raymond and Willett had to pass several other boarders' rooms. At 2 a.m. on Wednesday, November 17th, the two men entered through an unlocked hidden door used only by boarders, a useful tidbit from Willett, and proceeded up the stairs to the hallway. What the men didn't count on was Ferreter's dog, who started barking, waking Ferreter, who got up to investigate and came into the hallway. Through a window at Ferreter's back, light from a 3/4 moon provided the only light with which Ferreter could see, but all he could see was a dark figure several feet away. He asked the man, Willett, what he wanted. He responded that he wanted a quart of whiskey, and that he had a friend downstairs and the two were going to go dig for clams. Ferreter was, of course, very irritated and said, "You're a hell of a man to come up here at this time of the night," and he refused to sell him any whiskey. And Willett disappeared back downstairs, or so Ferreter thought. The dog, having run to the other end of the hallway, continued to bark, so Ferreter went to the dog to silence it before it woke up his guests. On his way back to his room, Ferreter felt the eerie presence of a man right behind him, and when he turned around, Willett pressed a revolver to his head and told him to put his hands up. Willett might have misjudged Ferreter, because the Irishman, not one to be pushed around, grabbed Willett's wrists and yelled for help. John Ferreter, his brother, was first to arrive, and the three men became entangled in a struggle for the gun. Richard Connolly, the brother-in-law, rushed into the hallway and joined the whole melee. The four men stumbled toward the top of the stairs, passing the room of 26-year-old Charles Augustus Andrews, often referred to as Gus Andrews, and his roommate, James McNamara, who threw open their door. Patrick Ferreter yelled to Andrews, "For Christ's sake, get a light!" McNamara, John Ferreter, and Connolly succeeded in throwing Willett to the floor, and Patrick wrestled the gun from Willett's hand, emptying the chamber. At this point in Willett's story to Gabriel, he held up his right hand to show him where the trigger of the gun injured his index finger as it got ripped from him. He also said he was terrified the whole time he would be recognized by any of the men. Willett was tall and powerfully built. He knew how to hold his own, but he was outnumbered, without a gun and pinned to the floor. He called out to Raymond to start shooting, and in an instant, three things happened. Patrick Ferreter spotted a dark figure on the stair landing. Gus Andrews arrived on the scene with the requested candle, and 4 shots were fired from the figure on the landing. Andrews fell to the floor after a bullet struck his abdomen, and when Connolly abandoned Willett to help Andrews, a second bullet hit Connolly in his right leg. Willett broke free, flew down the stairs, and lost his hat as 2 more shots were fired, the bullets burying themselves in the walls of the hotel. Raymond and Willett bolted from the hotel, but Willett stopped Raymond, asking him for the gun because he wanted to go back and finish off Patrick Ferreter, but Raymond refused. They ended up at Holy Cross Cemetery and decided there to split up. Raymond went north to San Francisco, and Willett proceeded south towards San Mateo. Willett said he didn't want anyone to die. In this case, it was Gus Andrews, who had been at the Western Meat Company for only about 6 or 7 months. Willett said he felt pretty badly about that. He knew Andrews and knew him as a good guy. The bullet had entered Andrews' abdomen near his groin, then it lodged in his spine. He ended up dying from peritonitis 3 days after the shooting. Not much is known about Charles Augustus Andrews except that he was a native of San Mateo County and had spent much of his previous 14 to 15 years in Palo Alto. Willett said that after escaping from Baden, going south, circumventing the San Francisco Bay, he received help from unsuspecting and sympathetic dairy farmers who provided this very personable stranger with a new hat, coat, and a warm breakfast. He hitched rides and walked, and credited a stray dog that followed him with making him appear as a local ranch hand and not a fugitive. He stopped briefly in Tracy, 50 miles east of the bay, where he read about Raymond's arrest in the papers, then continued to Ripon, another 20 or so miles east. He worked on Gabriel's farm for a little over 2 weeks, then eventually made his way south to Arizona. Willett told Gabriel that he'd rather die than go back to Folsom, so if he did get caught, he told Gabriel to bring him some poison concealed inside a plug of tobacco. "I can chew around the outside of the plug," he said, "and officers will never suspect that there was poison in it. When the time comes, I can take the drug and it will be all over and no one will know how I got it." As entertained as Gabriel was, he didn't fully believe Willett, but did tell Constable Kiernam, who had actually talked to Willett on the farm before. Kiernam contacted Folsom and received Willett's photograph and record. It was then that Gabriel understood who John Henderson really was. Raymond's escape was short-lived, about 2 hours. He was seen walking on Mission Road near the San Mateo County line in San Francisco and was stopped. He told the officer that he had been in San Jose collecting for the Salvation Army and had left a few days earlier to head up to San Francisco. The officer asked him what kind of wages he earned, and Raymond replied, "God pays me." Okay, well, why did he carry a .38 caliber gun with him? For protection, he said. As for why 4 or 5 of the chambers in the gun were empty and had appeared to have been recently fired, Raymond said he was target practicing near Baden. Another clue Raymond was likely the guy was that his coat was covered in pink calcimine, a kind of interior paint popular in those days. It would often flake off, and that seemed to have occurred because it had been used on the interior walls of the hotel. It didn't help that Raymond also had a piece of paper with him with a list of addresses for steam laundries in the city, seen as potential businesses to rob, not to have his coat laundered. It was all enough to arrest him. Meanwhile, Patrick Ferreter didn't recognize the man he grappled with as Willett, but did accurately describe him. Tall, 5'11" to 6 foot, thin, powerfully built, clean-shaven, and the other man as short. Raymond's height was never specified, but by all accounts, Willett was taller than Raymond. That was never disputed. Ferreter also said that undoubtedly the man would have plenty of marks and bruises on his face and head. It was indeed very dark inside the hotel. There were many references to this, that it was tough to get a good look at the two men. Richard Connolly actually credited the darkness with hindering the shooter. "The only thing that saved me was the gloom," he said. "Had there been sufficient light, he certainly would have killed me, as there was not 10 feet distance between us when he fired. Connolly even said that when he joined the mayhem, he couldn't tell friend from foe, at one point grabbing onto Patrick Farrader, who said, "For God's sakes, hit the other fellow." Before the shooting began, Connolly heard the man on the stairs yell, "Let go of my pal or I'll riddle you." That's the time Andrews came out with the candle. The shooting began, and Willett broke loose. Connolly, of course, would recover. Farrader said that after the men escaped, he looked out the window, and the tall one had tripped over the water trough outside, that he had lost his hat at some point, and that he was bald. This detail didn't fit Willett, but his hairline did recede a little. Raymond, however, was definitely bald. Later, during trial, the moon and what phase it was in at the time would be fiercely debated. Was it full? Was it 3/4? How much light would there be? What about clouds? Either way, it seemed to be much brighter at trial than it was during the course of the crime. Some people in town described two suspicious men loafing around town before the crime. One was short and whiskered, about 45 years old, and, quote, particularly evil looking. The other was taller, clean-shaven, and noticeably bald. And they were pretty much describing Harry Winters and Charles Raymond. Raymond was taken up to San Francisco to Captain Isaiah Lees. Remember him from episode 3, the Kovalev story? The legendary detective and police captain who always got his man. He was still a couple of years off from retirement at this point. He and his officers recognized Raymond as Samuel E. Moore and were able to confirm his recent release from Folsom. Officers took Raymond to St. Mary's Hospital, where Richard Connolly mostly identified him. He wasn't 100% positive Raymond was either of the robbers. Gus Andrews was said to have made a similar identification when he was still conscious. Not 100%, but close enough. Raymond was turned over to San Mateo Sheriff Joel Henry Mansfield and Deputy Fred Dezzarello in Redwood City. At this point, Raymond is still denying involvement in the crime, saying he had been on a, quote, protracted spree and was not responsible for his actions. So some kind of alcohol or other drug bender. When asked if he had had a hand in the crime, he said, "Well, if I did, I don't know it." Dezzarello claimed to recognize him as a man who was hanging around Baden the day before. Now, interestingly, on the 23rd, about a week later, Captain Lees claimed that Raymond had confessed to him and that he named James Willett as his companion in crime. Lees said he had sat on it while he and his men tried to locate Willett, but that seemed odd to me because releasing the information, including a sketch of Willett, to the public would have only helped them. So I found that very unrealistic. A few other things about this so-called confession didn't seem right. If Raymond had confessed, Sheriff Mansfield and Deputy Dezzarello would have been told, but they didn't know, and were still trying to ascertain the details. Even Raymond wouldn't have kept denying the crime to them. He would have known the men knew. Another thing is that the confession didn't offer any details that weren't already known and published in the papers. The story was that Raymond and Willett, both released from Folsom, decided to rob the hotel after drinks in the place the day before. This confession hit the papers on the 23rd November and ran for about a day, maybe two, and it was basically the same article that originated from a San Francisco newspaper. Then it seemed to just gotten dropped, never mentioned again, not at the coroner's inquest a day later, or the preliminary hearing in December, or at trial. Even if it had been deemed inadmissible for any reason, that would have been discussed, and Captain Lees would have testified at any of the court proceedings. So here's what I think. Because Raymond was recognized as Samuel E. Moore, it would have been easy enough to call over to Folsom and get some details, such as who Raymond associated with while he was there, and if any of them had been released around the same time. Because if Raymond had been locked up for 9 years and was known to have run solo before his prison sentence, it's likely his companion was someone he knew on the inside. There's a good chance Raymond said something that also helped piece that all together. Who knows? But they also had a description provided by Ferreter. Not that it was entirely accurate, but enough to resemble James Willett. I think given the pieces they had, Lees and his officers guessed right when they said it was Willett. It just made sense. So on the night of the 24th, the day after this confession, Sheriff Mansfield, dressed in plainclothes, and Deputy Desarello, acting on what they called information from a private source that a suspicious guy, given the name of James Green, was hanging around some waterfront saloons up in San Francisco, and that he evidently knew something of the Bodden affair. In this very clandestine move, the lawmen quietly made the arrest around 10 p.m., being very careful not to even notify the San Francisco police of what was going on. They had James Green, a.k.a. Harry Winters, in Redwood City by midnight. The next day, the press wrote that 45-year-old Winters, a Swede, admitted to knowing Charles Raymond, or Samuel E. Moore. I met him at the state prison, he said, and I haven't seen him since. The paper also wrote that the authorities were in the process of digging up Winters' record. Now, it wasn't really an easy process to determine a person's criminal record back then. It took a lot of time and effort and various channels to confirm identification, especially with aliases, an added complication that was very common because it was very easy to pull off then. And then getting documents sent, that was a whole other thing. And that was just if you were searching in-state. Outside state lines, that was a whole other matter. But Raymond, Willett, and Winters made it easy, really. Anyhow, even though Winters admitted he knew Raymond, which was probably smart because he knew they would have put that together anyway, he adamantly denied being involved in the crime. They will find, he said, that they have arrested an innocent man. I was not in Bodden at the time of the holdup and can prove it. We'll get to that because this is where things got kind of messed up, if you ask me. One paper tried to say that Winters was named in that so-called confession of Raymond's. Despite very big discrepancies between Willett and Winters, Patrick Ferreter identified Winters as the man he fought in the hallway. Now, Winters was not tall. In fact, he was the shortest of the three, and a little stocky. And he was in his mid-40s and not exactly capable of warding off 4 very strong men. Willett, however, in his mid to late 20s, was strong enough to put up a good fight, and he did. Winters didn't have a ton of hair, but he wasn't bald, and if you recall, Ferreter had said that the man would, quote, undoubtedly have marks and bruises on his face and head. Sure, it was a week later, but Winters didn't have any signs of recent facial injuries at all. But a few people recognized him as someone who was seen in town the day before the crime. Even the coroner's jury couldn't name, though, who they felt were responsible, which really pissed off Mansfield. It was very interesting to see how the case morphed and shifted after the arrest of Winters. It was both subtle and obvious how Winters became Willett, and yet police were still looking for Willett, offering a $250 reward for his capture. So now, how can Winters be the man? And that to me seemed like why the confession went quietly away too. And Willett wasn't mentioned much, except deemed as now the lookout. But Farrader said he was sure just 2 men ran from the hotel. Everyone knew there was a good chance Willett would get away, but now they had this other man, and it would be pretty easy to manipulate or shift the evidence a little to make Winters fit. And his background, released from Folsom a year prior, only strengthened the case, or bias, against him. And Raymond still wasn't talking. Attorney P.B. Nagel, who had represented Winters back in 1890, was now, 7 years later, appearing for him at his preliminary hearing on December 8th. The defense didn't put up any witnesses, but did say that Winters was in San Francisco at the time because he actually worked for John Nagel, his attorney's brother, serving papers, and was in his office in the days leading up to the crime and after. Here's the question I have. If we go by what dates Edward Gabriel, the potato farmer, gave, the arrest of Winters was the night before he met Willett, who was using the name John Henderson, and it wasn't until about December 1st or 2nd that Willett was said to have spilled the tea. And remember, Constable Kiernan called Folsom. It wouldn't have taken too long to locate Willett's information. They knew when he was released, so they would have found out by certainly December 8th, I would have thought. Yet Gabriel's story of meeting Willett and hearing Willett's story was kept under wraps, at least for a few more months. So prison authorities, most definitely, warden all, knew of Willett being in Salida and of what he told Gabriel. And I don't think Gabriel could have been wrong about the date he met Willett. Thanksgiving Day, holidays are generally a good memory marker. Willett's identity was confirmed, and he knew a hell of a lot about the crime, yet someone, or someones, decided not to share any of this, at least not with the public, and certainly not the defense. Today, that would be a violation of the federal rules of criminal procedure. The prosecution cannot knowingly keep information that's beneficial to the defendant. These laws of discovery weren't standardized until 1938, after Folsom's last execution, by the way. Before that, there were common law practices, but they were case-specific, under judicial discretion, and very inconsistent. A, quote, fair trial really only meant being judged, hopefully, fairly by an impartial jury. But being tried fairly was something entirely different. As expected, Patrick Farrader and his brother John, along with John McNamara, Gus Andrews' roommate, and John Connolly, all identified Winters as the man they fought with. Suddenly, it wasn't so dark inside the hotel. There was plenty of moonlight. They were so sure of Winters. So here you really have just eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. It's hard to say if Patrick Farrader and the others knew Winters wasn't there, because sometimes it's very difficult for eyewitnesses to really know for sure what they saw. Let's assume that the men subconsciously subbed in Winters. There are so many things that can influence our memories. Our brains can be sneaky in that way, innocently deceiving us. Because let's face it, it's complicated up there. Things get crossed, merged, intertwined, suppressed. I won't get into the science behind memory, not that I'm well-versed or knowledgeable about it, but I can say humans are pretty bad when it comes to memory and eyewitness testimony especially, which is why it's the leading cause of wrongful convictions today. We're talking 75% of those who have been exonerated just from the 1990s. Eyewitness testimony in their case led to their wrongful conviction. Why does this happen? Stress, bias, suggestive information from others, cross-racial problems. People generally have a difficult time correctly identifying people of a different race than their own. Even the presence of a weapon affects correct identification of a person because the eyewitness tends to be more focused on the weapon a perpetrator is holding, and then their brain attempts to fill in the blanks, the missing details of the perpetrator themselves. And these details matter. When someone is presented to you who might resemble the person, it's very easy to make yourself believe that is the correct person. Your brain wants to make it happen. So much plays into this. And it's also not hard to see how people simply don't care about getting it wrong. That's where that bias comes in. And in 1897, the prevailing belief was that you either had criminal tendencies or you didn't. So even if you weren't involved, if you are a former convict, you're always a convict. Sadly, that belief hasn't really changed. So you probably deserve to be found guilty. Groupthink or group mentality could have played into it too. No one wants to be the person who doesn't go along with something. Did they just want to convict someone? Felt it was better to be safe than sorry? There could be any number of reasons why the witness accounts changed. We'll never know. So if you want to learn more about the pitfalls of eyewitness testimony, you'll find some links in the show notes. Winters would be tried first, separate trials, each set for January 1898. And Raymond still had not named Winters as his partner in crime. He really wasn't doing any talking at all. At Winters' trial, Patrick Farrader told the court that he had seen Winters in town 3 times. On November 9th or 10th, he couldn't recall. And on the 16th, and then the next morning, as the man he grappled with. He claimed that Winters and Raymond came into the hotel on the evening of the 9th or 10th. And one said, "Give us a glass of beer, Pat." Farrader didn't know them, so was surprised they knew his name. They drank, then left, going toward the city. He said he saw Winters in his hotel on the 16th, having a beer and crackers. About 6 feet away, Farrader had been talking to a boarder about settling his lodging bill and how Farrader would have a few $100s later that night, since it was payday at the Western Meat Company. These remarks, he said, would have been overheard by Winters, who then left. Farrader closed up at 10 p.m. and was woken at 2 a.m. by Winters. He said he saw his face clearly in the moonlight, the same man who sat at the bar the day before. Nothing about the man being tall, clean-shaven, thin, or powerfully built. And then the hat that was left behind. When Winters tried it on, it was far too big for his head. It was also a different kind of hat than the one that he was allegedly seen wearing by witnesses before the crime. Rachel Tenenbaum, owner of a secondhand store, she identified Winters as the man who purchased 2 guns from her on October 27th. And when shown the 2 revolvers, she said they were the same ones. Richard Connolly, Farrader's brother-in-law, who said it was so dark inside the hotel he couldn't tell friend from foe, positively identified Winters as the man he wrestled with, and as the one he also saw with Raymond in town on the 9th or 10th. But John McNamara, Gus Andrews' roommate, and described as a cautious man, said he wasn't 100% positive it was Winters, but that he sure looked like him. Deputy Fred Dizzarello testified, as he had before, that he saw Winters and Raymond together about 9 p.m. on the 16th and followed them as they moved in the direction of the Grand Hotel, Winters wearing a black derby hat, not the kind of hat found at the scene. They had disappeared behind a building and the deputy didn't pursue them. Another man, a laborer at one of the meatpacking places, said he saw two men in Baden on the 16th, one being Winters, then said the other was Raymond when he saw Raymond brought into court. Aside from the witness statements of the men involved, which were arguably inconsistent, all of their evidence was purely circumstantial. When the defense opened, Winters' attorney asked that the jury be brought to the hotel in order to view the scene, but this was denied. Winters took the stand, saying he had been in Baden on the 16th looking for work, was with a guy but didn't know his name, and that while he knew Raymond, he hadn't seen him in Baden. Before leaving town, he said he had gone to the Grand Hotel for a beer and crackers, then left, going back to San Francisco where he met up with a man named Charles George. They hit some saloons before Winters went to the Salvation Army on New Montgomery Street, where he paid for a 5-cent bed for the night. To prove Winters' alibi, Charles George and another man, John Slagle, were called to testify, and they did, saying they saw Winters in San Francisco on the 16th, or it could have been the 17th. They couldn't say for sure. James Nagel, brother to Winters' attorney who had employed Winters to do odd jobs, testified that he saw Winters on the morning of the 17th and every day until his arrest on the 24th, and noticed nothing unusual in his demeanor or appearance. No facial bruising or head wounds whatsoever. Remember, Patrick Farrader said after the crime that the man would absolutely have marks on his face and head. In rebuttal, the prosecution called the night watchman of the Salvation Army on New Montgomery Street, and he said that while he had seen Winters there on other occasions, including with Raymond and Willett, he didn't see Winters on the night of the 16th. The jury was out only 25 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. This even came as a surprise to the press, who indicated they felt the case against Winters was on the weak side, that if anything, life imprisonment, something less than first-degree murder. When Winters, looking pretty worn and haggard, heard the verdict, he immediately jumped to his feet and addressed the jury, saying, "Gentlemen of the jury, I don't blame you for what you have done, but I do blame these liars, perjurers, bribers, and murderers." Raymond's trial began the next day, and he evidently appeared fairly unconcerned, which described his demeanor during the entire trial. His court-appointed attorney didn't ask many questions, focusing mainly on how much light was in the hotel at the time, but no one could really give a clear answer. It was a subjective debate about an environment that couldn't exactly be recreated easily. How much light does a 3/4 moon give off? Attorneys attempted to measure how much light one candle emitted, but even that failed because conditions weren't the same in the courtroom. Witnesses had a more difficult time identifying Raymond at the scene since he stood on the stair landing, far from any light source there may have been. They acknowledged that they didn't get a good look at him, including Richard Connolly, who was pretty darn sure it was Raymond when the defendant was brought to the hospital to be identified. The strongest evidence against Raymond was the gun found on him when he was arrested. It was identified as the one bought in October by Harry Winters. And again, Deputy Desarello said he saw Raymond and Winters walking in the direction of the hotel. Not much testimony in this trial. Raymond didn't take the stand. No one for the defense did. They simply relied on the fact that identification was incomplete. The jury took a little bit longer with this one, still less than an hour. 2 ballots had been taken. The first all agreed on guilt, but one person recommended life imprisonment, but then all agreed on death in the second ballot. On January 20th, Attorney Nagel had moved for a stay of judgment on a few grounds, one being newly discovered evidence, but Judge Buck denied it. When Harry Winters was sentenced to die on April 8th, he tried to say something but was unable to find the words. Judge Buck spoke instead, saying, "The community and the court approve of the verdict, and you must not indulge in any vain illusion or hope that delay will save you. Your case is too clear, so prepare yourself as best you may." Raymond's indifferent demeanor carried over into his sentencing, not even wincing when sentenced to hang on the same day, April 8th. During his incarceration in the Redwood City Jail, Raymond rarely spoke and ate very little. He didn't even speak much during his trip on January 25th to Folsom with Sheriff Mansfield. But then, on February 7th, a rather dismal, drizzly day, Raymond cracked. He asked Warden All to bring him a chaplain, a Brother Chisholm from San Francisco. He wanted to confess. The warden was very busy and had other matters to deal with, wrote the Sacramento Bee. But Raymond was insistent, anxious, because he needed to unburden himself. An innocent man was going to die, he said, and he didn't want that on his conscience. Warden called the clergyman, and he said he could be there the next day, but Raymond didn't want to wait. According to the Sacramento Bee, Raymond said that he and Winters had checked out the hotel together a week before the crime, contemplating whether or not to rob it, then went back to San Francisco. Winters had a couple of guns, and Raymond asked to borrow one, and Winters obliged. A few days later, Raymond said he met James Willett at a Salvation Army meeting. He said he had known Willett from Folsom, but it wasn't a planned meetup. He said Willett happened to suggest robbing the Grand Hotel, that he knew the owner and knew he'd have money on Wednesday morning. Willett didn't want anyone else on the job, so they decided just the 2 of them would do it. But that on the 16th, the 2 men ran into Winters near the cemetery in Baden. Raymond said, "I do not know what Winters was doing at the Holy Cross Cemetery the day before the murder. He said he was going to look for a job in the Baden packing house, but I do not know if he was going to Baden for that purpose or not. I did not see Winters at Baden that night." He asked Winters if he could use his other gun. He had given the one he borrowed already to Willett, and Winters handed it over. He allegedly left the men, and Raymond and Willett hid out before going to the hotel around 2 in the morning. I think he took a little liberty with the truth there. I'm sure Winters didn't just happen to be in Baden that day. But that's really beside the point, because Winters' actual role was the difference between first-degree murder, punishable by death, and, say, second-degree or manslaughter. At the time, California's criminal code didn't have rules pertaining to homicide and complicity. That will definitely come later. As for my 93 guys, that'll come into play in about the 1920s. Today, you might have heard of the felony murder rule, a legal doctrine that states that if someone dies, either killed or dies by, say, a heart attack as a result of a felony being committed by someone, regardless of intent, the offender can be found guilty of murder, as well as any accomplices. For instance, 3 guys rob a bank. 1 shoots a security guard, even if he didn't mean to. That could mean first-degree murder for him and for the other 2, which could also mean a death sentence for each of them. The security guard could have cracked his head open on the floor when he tackled one of the guys to the ground. There are some nuances, and they vary a little from state to state, but it's a controversial rule for sure. Several other countries have abolished this rule, but the U.S. does love its punitive ways, and 48 states and the District of Columbia still use this rule. Like I said, this will come up in later episodes, but I'll have some links in the show notes. It's worth taking a look at. So Raymond, in his confession, admitted it was him who fired the shot that killed Gus Andrews. Harry Winters, who was here in the prison with me with the sentence of death of Andrews, had nothing to do with the killing of that man at Baden, he said. Winters was not at the hotel on the night of the murder that I know of. James Willett was with me when the crime was committed. By all accounts, Raymond appeared extremely genuine. Even before his arrest in 1888, his strong religious faith was mentioned, so I tend to think he truly wanted to clear his conscience before his execution. Of course, the confession was not taken seriously. Detective Charles Crockett of the San Francisco police said that it was merely an attempt to save a friend and throw blame on a guy who hadn't been caught yet. For my investigation, Crockett said, I am convinced of Winters' guilt. The evidence at the trial of the accused men showed conclusively that he had a hand in the brutal murder. He cited the pair's connection at Folsom, that it was Winters who bought the guns, and witnesses identified him. As for Willett, he said, he may have known the plans of Moore and Winters, but after a thorough investigation, I am satisfied that he was not present when Andrews was killed. It seems to me that the alleged confession is nothing more than a clever scheme to save Winters' neck. He further stated, now, we know that Willett was not in the hotel at the time of the shooting. He might have been outside on the lookout, but he did not go into the house. The reason he did not go in was because he was known there. Had he been engaged in the shooting, he would have been recognized. Winters has been fully identified. It may be that Willett gave the lay of the house to Raymond and Winters, but he was not an actual participant in the murder. Did Crockett really not know? Was it just prison officials, that Constable Kiernan in Salida, who knew about Edward Gabriel and Willett's confirmed identity? Why was Crockett so sure Willett wasn't involved? What was his proof? Well, about 2 weeks later, February 28th, James Willett was captured by none other than Sheriff Joel Henry Mansfield in Fair Park, Arizona. Mansfield had received a suspicious letter from a man in Fair Park offering to give information about the murder at the Grand Hotel if the $250 reward was sent to him. The letter writer apparently gave details that only someone involved would know. At least that's what the report was. Mansfield wondered if it was Willett, so he contacted the sheriff in Prescott, and soon enough, a man fitting Willett's description was arrested, and Mansfield went to Arizona. It was indeed Willett. He didn't fight extradition and signed an agreement he'd return without any promise of immunity or reward. He reportedly said upon leaving jail, "Well, boys, it's all up with me." On March 3rd, Edward Gabriel's story broke. He now lived in San Jose, and it matched fairly close to the confession of Raymond. It gave even more details. The Sacramento Bee took the opportunity to be snarky and wrote, "When the Bee's story of Moore's confession was printed, it was ridiculed by Detective Crockett of San Francisco. which shows that even San Francisco detectives do not know it all. Gabriel's story is clear and replete with details, wrote the San Francisco Call, that tend to show he had undoubtedly been told nothing but the truth by Willett. And that newly discovered evidence that Winter's attorney referred to at sentencing, this was it. I don't know how he found out and why it still had taken this long to come to light. He said, "I knew this man in San Jose could be produced and appealed the case to the Supreme Court because I knew that this evidence would be of the greatest importance. Had I known of his existence during the time of the trial, I think that Winters could have easily been cleared. Much doubt had been thrown on the confession of Raymond, and I think the statement of this new witness shows that Raymond's confession was genuine." So it still begs the question, who knew and who kept it quiet? Locked up in the Redwood City jail, charming Willett, with his side grin and piercing blue eyes, was presented with Edward Gabriel. At first, he didn't own up to knowing the farmer, but soon warmed up. He not only talked about the crime, he went into more stories. I don't have time to go into them now, so I'll add a bonus clip on the Patreon if you want to hear more. He didn't want to make a statement, preferring to wait so he could secure legal advice. He had not seen the report of Raymond's confession, and once he read it, he refused to confirm or deny any of it. When asked about Winter's involvement, he was careful, trying, I'm sure, to determine what cards he might be able to play. He said, "You know, I have my neck in a sling, and you don't want me to hang myself, do you? I will tell you what I know at the right time, and if I have to swing, we will all swing together. I don't want to talk about my case until I have an attorney. I don't want to be put in a position where I may later have to contradict anything I may now say if I were to make a statement." Willett took a very light-hearted approach to his predicament. "I would just as leave swinging on the end of a rope as go back to Folsom," he said. "Perhaps I'll swing anyway. It makes no difference. I have found in my experience that I have to pay the state for nearly all the tricks I ever turned, and I guess I have not paid all my debts yet." The San Francisco Call wrote that Willett, quote, hinted at several crimes he had committed and for which he never was suspected. For those crimes, he said, he should have spent twice his lifetime in prison, and the sentences he had already served were for crimes in which he was but slightly implicated. Raymond and Winters, he said, were his accomplices in most of his crimes. Now, whether or not Gabriel brought him that poison in a cigar, we don't really know, but it doesn't appear so. Willett's preliminary hearing was set for March 19th, and meanwhile, papers revealed that on February 1st, Sheriff Mansfield had made a play for the reward money. You may remember from episode 3 when Captain Lees in San Francisco attempted this and lost. And after a lengthy court battle, it was determined that officers of the law were not eligible for reward money. The claim, however, was submitted under the sheriff's brother's name, C.T. Mansfield, and that it was for half of the $250 that was put up on November 25th for Willett, but that it was for capturing Harry Winters. First of all, the sheriff tried to get around that law by having his brother make the claim. And second, there wasn't any reward money for Winters anyway. It was strictly for Willett, not that the sheriff could legally make claims to that. The sheriff and his brother were now being investigated for fraud. But, big surprise, the following month, C.T. Mansfield, the sheriff's brother, was awarded $125 for the arrest of Winters. Seemed a little weird. Certainly an incentive to keep a man in prison, to not investigate claims of innocence. Anytime there's money to be made in convictions and keeping people incarcerated, you have problems, like private prisons, and that's a whole other episode. As his preliminary hearing approached, James Willett seemed to get nervous and denied any involvement in the crime, saying that he only first heard of it when he was brought to Redwood City. Then on March 19th, James Willett appeared for his preliminary, and he confessed he took part, but that he waited outside while Raymond and Winters carried out the failed robbery. He did admit to coming up with the plan, though. He would officially plead guilty on April 12th. Harry Winters' case was on appeal, but things were held up because Judge G.A. Buck refused to certify the Bill of Exceptions, a record of trial objections and a requirement for an appeal. Now, it was a tedious process at the time, and Judge Buck didn't like the way the attorneys presented it to him, so he didn't do it. Winters' attorneys had to file to the state Supreme Court to compel the judge to do his duty. Meanwhile, Raymond would mount the gallows alone. On April 7th, the night before, he was reportedly resigned to his fate and spoke with remorse and contrition over what he had done. He was also concerned about Winters, wanting very much to save his life. He said his true name was Daniel Monday, that he was from New York, and that he had enlisted in the U.S. infantry and in 1872 was sent to Fort Vancouver in Washington. But he deserted the military and eventually served a couple of terms in the Oregon Penitentiary for burglary and robbery under the name George A. Moody, which I was able to confirm. He then came to San Francisco under the name Samuel E. Moore, and shortly after sentenced to Folsom in 1888 for burglary. One paper reported that he had refused to go to sleep, so he was given morphine, which had little effect, and that he stood against the wall of his cell, and when he got drowsy, he would pace. The next morning, on Good Friday, he received spiritual consolation from Reverend Fred Hunt, prison chaplain, and spent most of his alone time praying. One report said he ate a hearty breakfast, one said he ate nothing, and hadn't for 3 days. One report said he looked cool and collected. Another said he swayed in place and needed assistance to stand, and that his knees weakened a second before he fell through the trap. Of course, Charles All said Raymond confessed to him 30 minutes before his execution, implicating Winters after all. Raymond was then buried in the Folsom Prison cemetery. On April 12th, James Willett pleaded guilty, and 2 days later, during testimony to determine the degree of guilt, Sheriff Mansfield and District Attorney Henry Walker testified that on April 9th, Willett gave them his statement of the case, admitting he was the one who fought with Patrick Farrader and the other man. Even the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "This is probably true because Winters is small in stature and could not put up much struggle against 4 men. On the other hand, Willett weighs over 200 pounds, a powerful man." The paper also brought up the discrepancy regarding the hats and how the one in question didn't fit Winters. Well, yeah, they're just now bringing attention to these inconsistencies. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Willett replied, "No, sir, I am perfectly satisfied." After being sentenced to life at Folsom, he said, "Thank you, sir." James arrived at Folsom the same day Frank Ballou, our 11th execution, arrived on death row. He joined Winters and John Barthelman, our 10th execution. And remember Salter D. Warden, the train wrecker? His sentence finally got commuted in June 1898 after 4 years on death row. And just a little side note, a few months later, September 30th, 1898, Folsom had its first inmate killing, and it was by number 28, Jacob Oppenheimer. I've got a little special place in my heart for Jake. I know how that sounds, but you'll understand why when I get to his story. Eventually, let's get back to June, and the Bill of Exceptions was settled and Winter's case officially was appealed. 1899 opened with a new governor, Henry T. Gage, who was basically put in office by the railroad that owned most of California. He was a lawyer for them. Here's a pretty accurate description of him from an April 1899 editorial. California is a great state with a little governor. The author, a fellow Republican, said that other states had a series of freaks in the executive chair, but, quote, for crankiness, stupidity, bullheadedness, narrowness of mental grasp, minuteness of soul, lack of ability, and absence of magnetism, I would pit Gage against the lot. He said Gage was uncouth to the point of boorishness, commonplace, drunk with vanity, dual-witted as a burro, he essays the facetious with pitiful result. He cannot speak, he cannot write, cannot be civil. Undeserved fortune found in him the raw material for the making of a governor and got in its deadly work. A governor who cannot rise above petty spites, who cannot on occasion be broad, who forgets that he is in a place where politeness is prescribed, is unworthy the honor Gage has received. The state is sick of him already, and he has barely begun to exhibit his lack of qualification. It got worse, though, because in June, when a case of the bubonic plague hit California, he denied its existence because, well, it was bad for business. He lied so hard about it, which meant he did nothing about it, and it had serious consequences. Aside from all that, he also cut wages for state employees, he pocketed bills that would have given women some voting rights, he cut funding for public works projects and social programming, and gave favor to his Republican cronies. Gosh, I don't know who it reminds me of. I'll think of it. Anyway, he wasn't going to be of any help to those applying for pardons or commutations. In July, in a very rare split, 4-3, the state Supreme Court denied Harry Winter's appeal. Now, this was just based on the trial. The dissenting justices agreed with the defense's contention that Buck erred in his instructions to the jury about an alibi defense. They said that with an alibi, the accused isn't required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt or by a preponderance of evidence. And Judge Buck's failure to qualify, quote, a doubt with reasonable was prejudicial to Winters. They went further, pointing out another error, a completely contradictory instruction that said a defendant who, quote, sets up an alibi had to show facts about his whereabouts at the time of the crime as to make it, quote, impractical or impossible for him to have committed it. So which was it? And finally, another instruction they called erroneous and misleading. Quote, that the witness appearing to be willfully false in one part of his testimony as to the truth or falsity of a given proposition of fact is to be distrusted in other parts. The dissenting justices took issue, saying, it is not the appearance of giving false testimony, It is the belief that false testimony has been given, and that the instruction also left out the important element that the willful false testimony must be given on a material matter. Perhaps they had reasonable doubt about Winter's involvement and should have been acquitted, at the very least, a new trial. In late August, Winters was brought back to Redwood City for sentencing. He looked pretty rough. Sheriff Mansfield said Winters, quote, fought and abused him during the entire journey from Folsom. But Winters had accusations of his own. Of course, it is between this fellow, that scoundrel there, Winters said in court, referring to Mansfield. This scoundrel and warden all. He has bribed the jury. If I would have done as they wanted me to do, I could have got out of here over a year ago in June. They wanted me to get out and go and fight in Spain, but I wouldn't do it. He was referring to the Spanish-American War, fought between April and September of 1898. I told them I was innocent and I was going to see it through. They told me if I don't go, I will get the worst of it. I say I am innocent and I am going to stick to it. He then accused the prison, specifically Guard Haggerty, of poisoning his food for the previous 10 months. None of his claims were taken seriously, and he was sentenced to hang October 27th. Then a curveball. On October 9th, Warden Charles All died. He was 49, or just turned 50, and had been sick for a little while. But it was well known he had a severe drinking problem, and that his illness stemmed from that. I won't go into it all here, but I have another little bonus episode in the Patreon for you about Charles All that I think you'll really enjoy. So now what? The prison can't conduct an execution without the proper authorities in place. There was great debate about this. The thought was that Captain of the Guard, R.J. Murphy, would step in, but Murphy wasn't sure this was legal, and he wasn't keen on doing it either. Governor Gage could then issue a reprieve while the State Board of Prison Directors made a decision. Now, the State Board of Prison Directors and that fiasco of a group is another story on its own. So I'll try to drop another bonus in the Patreon about that soon. The decision to not put Murphy in charge was not made until the night before Winter's execution. I saw Winters in his cell last night, Governor Gage told the press, but he did not know that I was the governor. He was sound asleep when I called, and Murphy had to rap loudly on the iron several times before he could be aroused. The condemned man acted in every way as he wanted to die on the gallows. When Murphy informed him that I had reprieved his sentence 40 days, he remarked, "Don't forget the keg of beer and band." Winters had previously requested this, that he be executed to the music of a band playing. He had also, by the way, offered his body to science, which he figured would not only yield important scientific information, of which he didn't say, but also about $150, enough to pay his debts. Governor Gage added that Winters certainly deserved hanging and appeared willing to meet his fate, and that he would have gladly permitted the execution had the Attorney General decided that Murphy was qualified to conduct the execution. Winters was reprieved until December 8th, 1899. In mid-November, it was announced that Thomas Wilkinson would be the prison's new warden. He had been gatekeeper, then in charge of commissary at San Quentin, but was ousted over the summer when that prison's new warden, Martin Aguirre, took over and cleaned house. Not unusual when a new warden was appointed, but a shock nonetheless to Wilkinson. But when one gate closes, another one opens. You'll hear more about Wilkinson later. He assumed his position on December 1st, and by the next day had invites sent out for Winter's execution. The first Wilkinson would even witness, having never observed any of the 13 executions at San Quentin that occurred while he was there. Winter's request to have beer and music for his execution was, of course, not honored. Reports said that Winters admitted that wasn't his real name, not a surprise, and that he was a German socialist. As his ankles were being strapped together, he looked out at the crowd below and asked, "Are any reporters present? I want to talk to you people, as I have got a right to. Since I have been here 10 months, I have been tortured. They tried to poison me and club my brains out. They wanted to starve me, and they did not give me enough to eat." The San Francisco Examiner said he had been troublesome and, quote, had to be punished severely several times to reduce him to submission. That was certainly the Folsom way. It was said that Charles All requested, through Sheriff Mansfield, that Winters be executed at Folsom, which I thought was very interesting. And also, the press was typically permitted to interview the condemned the morning of the execution, or, if anything, the night before. This wasn't the case with Winters, and I have to wonder, was it because he had accusations of abuse? Harry Winters died about 10.5 minutes after falling through the trap. Doctors dissected his brain afterwards, and according to reports, it was found abnormal. About the size, they said, of a female's brain. The Examiner said, "The doctors declare that the brain almost corresponds to that of an idiot. They agreed in the conclusion that the brain showed that Winters was possessed of a very low order of intelligence, and that his death was deserved." That belief was the result of eugenics, the scientifically inaccurate theory that things like human intelligence and social behaviors were inherited, and that selective breeding was the answer to weeding out the undesirable qualities in people. This movement, along with phrenology, was really gaining popularity in the late 1890s, and it really goes much deeper and affected, and still does, frankly, every marginalized group, anyone of color, of course, or anyone from different ethnic backgrounds, homosexuals, and those with mental disabilities. Proponents of eugenics believe that those deemed inferior deserve to die for the sake of humanity. I highly doubt there was any scientific validity to what the doctors determined with Winters' brain dissection. He asked to be cremated, but was not, and was buried near Raymond in the prison cemetery. As for James Willett, he died at Folsom of esophageal cancer on April 23, 1908. Oh, and in case you're interested, like I was, about Patrick Farrader, he ended up remarrying in 1898 to Margaret Cotter, also Irish. She was about 26. He was 42. They had 3 more children, so 4 with the little girl he had previously. He died in 1903, the same year his 3rd child with Margaret was born. So here she was, about 31, single, and 4 kids. And they didn't own the hotel anymore because Patrick filed for bankruptcy in 1901. But she owned a grocery store. She remarried in 1905 to a Thomas Kelly. Then, in 1906, her grocery store suffered a fire. She filed a claim. And then 9 days later, she died. But the 4 kids lived on in the same area, too, well into elderly age, so that's good. See, this is why I had to go to 1 episode a month. Once I look up one person, it's like the thread of a sweater. So, anyways, I find this case so interesting. It's not like circumstantial evidence is anything new. Chin Hain, Folsom's first execution, was convicted on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence and a little sketchy eyewitness testimony. But the mishandling of this case really seemed blatant. Now, it's true. Winters wasn't guiltless. He did supply the guns, did some surveillance, but that's not what he was accused of. And some may think, oh, it doesn't matter. He wasn't involved. They might as well all go down. But no. If you're going to convict someone, do it right. Do it on the up and up. And if you get it wrong, or you see wrongs being made, have the integrity to say or do something. Look, I'm sure there are guilty people running around who were acquitted because it was only circumstantial evidence against them. But I'll put money down. There are more innocent people in prison convicted on circumstantial evidence. I get it. It is a conundrum. But as I have said before, if it was you or someone you love wrongfully accused of a crime, you're definitely going to hope a jury won't convict you on the circumstantial evidence. And frankly, whether or not that happens to us or to someone we know, we should care. We don't care enough that faulty evidence from a wide variety of sources is really an epidemic in this country. Because eyewitness testimony is so precarious, some jurisdictions are attempting to reduce mistakes by changing how and when witnesses are interviewed, how lineups are conducted, or bringing in experts to inform juries about this. It all requires substantial buy-in by a lot of people, and after a lot of educating them. But we live in a day and age where change doesn't have to be glacially slow. These injustices affect each and every one of us. All right, I'll leave it there, but I would like to know what you think. Did Winters really deserve to be hanged? I think you all know how I feel about it, but I want to know what you think. Next episode, we'll head back to Los Angeles, and I'll tell you about John Barthelman, a German salesman for the Singer sewing machines. He was also pretty bitter over his divorce, not unlike John Craig from episode 4, also in Los Angeles. The trial brought out some fascinating insights into society's views and opinions of mental illness. The proceedings seemed to be a source of entertainment and laughter for the spectators. So I hope you'll join me for that one. But in the meantime, you can head over to Patreon and listen to the story of Charles All. I think you'll enjoy it. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also leave a review, and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on my Substack page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also be able to listen to each episode. Find the show on YouTube as well. Check the show notes for links, including one for Patreon, where I share lots of extras. Join me every third Friday of the month, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.